Hello, humanoids. It's Adam Akbar. How are you doing? Again, I don't have a PowerPoint for this one, and I'm just doing an outline of the assigned uh, reading in hopes that this helps you comprehend and think about this stuff. So, this is our lecture that wraps up this module on research with human subjects. This is the last of week 10 on science and indigenous communities. Last time we looked at the Tuskegee syphilis study, which is a story about systematic racism and its intersection with research ethics and injustice. This continues the theme of research with communities who have a long-standing relationship characterized by unethical practices on the part of the U.S. government, right? So that's kind of in detail what this is about. It's also just research with vulnerable populations, you could say, indigenous communities. I want to go down to the bottom real quick. I linked here, this is the article that you need to read and that I've outlined here. If you're interested in learning more about Native Americans, it's certainly not my specialty, but I read this book recently. I wanted to include it for you. I thought it was very accessible and very educational. This is a link to the federal regulations governing research with human subjects, if you wanted to follow up on that. I thought I'd put this link here about Flint, Michigan, and community level ethics review in Flint, because many of you, I imagine, are not Native American, and it may help to kind of prompt your moral imagination and your sympathy if you think about being a member of the Flint community and you know about the water problems there, to think about the mistrust or distrust you might have with the government in that case. It might give you some insight to the way that many indigenous communities feel about the government and research institutions, specifically academic institutions, that want to come in and do some research with them. That kind of mistrust is very deeply set and long-standing, and that's part of this story. And the other thing I linked here is there are so many really interesting studies about indigenous knowledge and stories about this. This one from the conversation in 2018 starts with a story of these hawks that literally carry burning sticks from a fire and drop them a little ways away to intentionally spread the fire in order to get like rodents and other things that they want to hunt to come scurrying out of that area. This was like mind blowing to Western scientists, but the native peoples, in this case, this is Northern Australia, had known about this for millennia, right? And so I won't go into this in detail. This is more for a philosophy of science course. But I just think this intersects with this fascinating field of traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. And all of the things that we Westerners are learning about the way Native peoples have understood the world and how very often it's the case that they've known something that took a long time for Western science to catch up to. So that's the premise of this article. If you're just interested, it's just a optional thing for you to read. By the way, in the US, in California, and other places where we're struggling with wildfires, one of the things people are doing is turning to indigenous communities who long practiced fire management regimes that are turning out to be much wiser and more healthy for ecosystems and humans than what we've been practicing on our so-called scientific best practices for a long time. So anyways, this I think is just a fascinating intersection with this study. So let's look at this, and I'll just go through real quick. You'll have this outline, you got the article. Maybe you don't need me yakking at you, but maybe it helps. I guess one of the reasons I want to assign this one, maybe you think it's boring, and I apologize if you do, but I wanted to both hit this high level stuff about vulnerable populations, systemic racism, and get into the nitty gritty a little bit. This article does a good job of talking about what are the people and processes and institutions you have to actually do on the ground if you want to make research more ethical, if you want to actually include people, make it more participatory, if you got some ideal of justice you're striving for, how do you actually make it happen on the ground? And this article gives you a taste of that. So I hope that you appreciate it for that. So it starts with an untitled abstract, and I try to boil it down to a sentence for you. Basically, this is an article about developing this intertribal IRB, Institutional Review Board, to promote community level protection and participation and to honor Indigenous knowledge. That's what this article is about, I would say in a sentence. And I think this is a good practice for you to do, try to say in one sentence, what is an article about? Remember, IRBs are these decentralized nodes that are in charge of reviewing the ethics of any proposed research project, and they're typically at academic institutions. But these academic institutions, as you read a little bit about in here, have had a long history, in tandem often with the US government, of misusing, abusing, misrepresenting themselves, or otherwise having anything but upstanding ethical relationships with Native Americans and tribes and tribal governments. And so there's a need to take this IRB system and put it in the hands of actual tribes, tribal leaders, so that they can have a voice and indeed take leadership when it comes to research with their people, with their knowledge, with their lands, right? That's what this is all about. So in the introduction, does quite a bit here. Sets the wider context. Again, that book I cited at the end, if you haven't studied the history of oppression, discrimination, betrayal, forced relocation, cultural erasure with the boarding schools, for example, this is a part of the American story. Again, just like with Tuskegee and the racism that was on display there, it's hard to read about, but we have to reckon with it. It's part of the deal, right? So I think this just on its own face is important to think about. The Native peoples here, the indigenous tribes, have this history, and it's no wonder then, and the legacies with it, right? Poverty, poor health, and all the rest. It's no wonder that they are suspicious and distrustful when it comes to government-led scientific expeditions, right? Because they've always been exploited by such things. Well, not always, but for a long time and in many ways. Another context is indigenous lifeways and worldviews being systematically targeted for erasure and replacement with modern Western lifeways and scientific worldviews. That's big picture context. So leads to this mistrust. They give you an example. I believe it was Arizona State University and the Havasupai tribe, DNA collection that was collected on false premises. So it's those sorts of things in that deeper history that has led to this need for tribal IRBs. At least that's what they're making a case here. These tribal IRBs, they say, are also necessary due to, quote, federal and tribal differences in how human participant research is defined and the rights of tribes as sovereign nations. This, right, the rights of tribes as sovereign nations is an ongoing contested aspect of our living history. And this, differences in how research is defined, is kind of what I talked about earlier. What is knowledge? Are there different ways of knowing? And what do these indigenous ways of knowing have going for them that sometimes Western scientific ways could learn from, right? It's always been assumed that the colonizers, with their Eurocentric Western scientific view, had the best form of knowledge, the objective form of knowledge, and that everything else needed to clear away and be dismissed as metaphysics and mumbo jumbo and religion, right? And invalid ways of knowing. But I think what we're coming to see now is, whoa, that was not just way too simplistic and one-sided, but was also an act of systemic violence against peoples and cultures. So I think we're in a moment now in our history of trying to reckon with all of that. And this is one little piece with some details about how do we do it through the IRB system. So the article then jumps into the establishment of the actual board. here, and you can read about that. I've got some of the things, highlights pointed out. Note they spent a few years having conversations about how is it done and how could it be done better, and learning about all the diversity within IRBs. They then set up this consortium that would house the IRB. So that became kind of the broader framework within which this board would work. One of the important things it mentioned is that the control of research ethics review had gone up to the national level, and this brought it back to the region, which is important for them because they're talking about this community-led, community participatory research. And then I think what's really important here, and I didn't probably put enough time in my outline, is to look at the membership details, because that's what it's all about. Who gets to have a say when it comes to research? How you're going to define the research, what kind of research you're going to allow to occur. The membership is super vital. So at one point, for example, I didn't put it here, they talk about having I think they said a multi-ethnic female medical doctor involved. Why? Well, because it's important to have these perspectives involved and to platform the voices that you want to have represented. That's what they're trying to figure out here. They then, and you can look at this, they have what's going on here in this assessment of research regulation practices section. Well, the first one is a 6-step process to assess whether the existing regulations are adequate. And what they found is no, they're often inadequate because studies were being done without tribal representatives involved, or a tribe would sign an agreement, but they didn't understand or realize that that meant that an outside IRB without tribal representatives would be in charge of reviewing and managing that research project. So they did conclude, yes, we need to have our own IRB, an intertribal IRB. And then they had this 8-step process for setting it up that you can look at. This I thought was interesting. So this is the second to last section, protocols and implementation. Again, definition of research is such an interesting process going on here because the IRB traditional definition of research is one that is steeped in the modern Western scientific worldview. And in many ways, I think the tribes wanted to say, well, we think of research a little bit differently. And so we should have the ability to define it in our ways so that we don't miss some things going on that we consider to be research that we think we need to participate in the process of reviewing it and managing it, right? Another really important thing, ethics on a community level. Again, another thing going on with modern Western scientific worldview that we sort of need to excavate and think about is the individualism, right? We tend to think of protecting individual research participants, but what about protecting communities? And what about involving in whole communities to be engaged in a research process? That's a little bit different. But that's something super important to these tribes, and so they've got to find a way to build that in. They also talk about equity, inclusion, and transparency. So equity about how are the risks and benefits distributed of the research and who determines that and how is it determined? And transparency in terms of who's involved, what are you trying to do, how is this being governed, what are your informed consent processes? All of that needs to be upfront and documented. Okay, that's about it. At the end, they have some more ideas about what could happen next. I think it was really interesting when they said maybe we need a federal level recognition of some form for what constitutes indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge. That's really interesting. They need more work on what community-based participatory research means. If you're interested in this, Google that or hit me up with an email. This, I think, is a cutting edge part of research with human subjects, is trying to think through what do we mean by community-based, or they say community-engaged participatory research. There's a lot of research on that kind of research going on now. And then ultimately, you know, we set up these tribal IRBs and you start shifting the power dynamics back to the tribes and the people involved. That creates opportunities to not only learn about and promote indigenous worldviews and knowledge, but maybe to save to save these ways of knowing and these life ways. So there's a kind of case that this is helping me preserve diversity when it comes to epistemology, knowledge, and also culture, life ways. So that's important. Okay, hope this helps. And until next time, may the force be with you.